Consumers often face situations where they need to decide between multiple brands of a particular type of product, such as when people are deciding which type of iPad to buy, or sometimes within a particular brand, there are multiple models of a product, and consumers need to decide which model offers the best set of attributes that meet their needs. So when people are making decisions, there are different types of models that describe this process. One set of models focus on brand processing models, which is when people focus on brand by brand. They first go through all the attributes associated with one brand, such as an Apple product, and then subsequently might go through all the attributes associated with a Samsung brand. Conversely, there are attribute models where people compare across brands attribute by attribute. We're going to start with brand processing models and move to attribute processing models. Then within that distinction, there's the distinction between compensatory and non-compensatory models. A non-compensatory decision-making strategy eliminates alternatives that do not meet a particular criterion. In other words, if there's something bad that is particularly important to a consumer, another good element on another attribute cannot make up for that bad attribute. To give you an example, let's say you've got a car that you're evaluating. It's a great price, it looks really great, but then you find out that the brakes always fail. So in this situation, no evaluation on any of those other attributes could make up probably for the fact that the brakes fail. That dimension is non-compensatory for you. Whereas with a compensatory decision-making strategy, it weighs the positive and the negative attributes of considered alternatives and allows for positive attributes to compensate for the negative ones. So it's kind of like a balancing model. And we're going to walk through some examples here of how this can influence consumers' actual decision making. But first, a little bit more description of the definition. So multi-attribute models, such as the theory of reasoned action, which you were exposed to in the chapter about attitudes, is an example of a compensatory model. Whereas the conjunctive model is one example of a non-compensatory model. This is used when a consumer establishes a minimum level of acceptability on each brand attribute. Any brand will be deemed unacceptable if it performs below the minimum acceptable cutoff point. On the other hand, the disjunctive rule is the flip side of the conjunctive rule. So it's used when the consumer establishes a minimum acceptable performance standard which each brand must meet. Any brand will be acceptable if it exceeds the minimum standard on each criterion. So it's a weeding out versus accepting difference. We're only going to focus here on conjunctive models because conjunctive and disjunctive are very similar. So don't get confused over those. It's a pretty minor nuance. So let's say here we've got the results of a customer satisfaction survey. You've got here on the left all the different criteria that people might consider when deciding going out to eat. They're evaluated in terms of their importance. That's this first column. And let's just say this is the average of consumers' importance evaluations in a particular segment. Then we've got consumers' average scores of McDonald's in the next column over, and then Burger King in the third column. In the fourth column, what we have is that importance score multiplied by the McDonald's performance score. So you can see 9 by 8 equals 72. And then in this final column, you've got the importance score, again, 9, multiplied by Burger King's performance score. So 9 times 6 equals 54. So that's how these numbers are computed. Then they're added up to come up with an overall total. So this is our multi-attribute model, which you're, again, familiar with because it was covered in the attitudes chapter. And you'll see that if a consumer is using a compensatory model, they would end up selecting McDonald's because the overall total score, 291, is higher than Burger King's, 269. And I've included the criteria for a conjunctive rule up here at the top. Remember, we've got importance, that's how important the attribute is, and then the actual performance of each option on that attribute. For the conjunctive rule, for the attributes that are more important, so anything that's above 3, the performance has to be at least 5. Let's look at that here first and see, all right, so we've got on this first criterion of locations, 9, that's above 3, so it's an important attribute. McDonald's, it's acceptable. It's also acceptable in terms of opening hours. The presence of a playground, that's an attribute that's below 3, so we would come back to that. Speed of service, important. McDonald's is satisfactory. Again, value for money, satisfactory. Comfort, satisfactory. Here, when we get to food quality, this is an attribute that's above 3, 4 out of 10. But because it's a 4 in terms of performance, that's below the cutoff. So McDonald's would be rejected here. And we'll go over to Burger King and see. Does it pass each of these thresholds? So 6, that's above 5. 8. Also above 5. 4, it's not above 5, but remember this attribute of playground is not as important to us per our attributes above 3 distinction there. 5, that's fine. 8, that's above 5. 6 is above 5, and 8 is above 5. So if the consumer is using a conjunctive rule, they would end up going with Burger King. So it's the point, one of the broader points here is that depending on the model that a consumer is using, that can lead them to make different choices. Okay, so attribute models are different from brand models because, like I said, the consumer compares them one attribute at a time. This is the consumer's preferred way to think. It's harder to compare within a brand and decide whether or not to go with it and then move on to another brand. People like seeing evidence laid out side by side so they can compare attributes. So some of the more famous or research-supported non-compensatory attribute processing models are the elimination by aspects and lexicographic decision-making model. So with elimination by aspects, first, you order the attributes in terms of what is most important to the consumer, and then it's a matter of eliminating the ones that are unsatisfactory, and then you see what's left. Whereas the lexicographic rule, this is a very, it's a heuristic-driven decision-making rule where people can make a decision really quickly. So if there's time pressure or people are, if they're experiencing loss aversion, they're more likely to use this kind of rule where they just say, what is the most important to me, and then what option performs the best on that dimension. Let's make this a little bit more concrete. So here's a situation where, let's say it's a student considering which apartment to rent. And we've got 5 options: apartment A, apartment B, apartment C, apartment D, apartment E. And then we've got the 5 criteria that are the most important to that student: cost, size, location, view, has a pool. And then we've got the performance of each of these different apartment options on each of these different dimensions. And then separately, we've solicited the importance values from this particular person. You'll note that the values all add up to 100, and this is how it's actually done often in practice, where people are given a set of evaluative criteria and told to divide points among them so that they all add up to equal 100. Okay, so we're going to look and see, based on these different rules, which apartment would the student select. So if we're using the compensatory model, which we've described before, it's just the sum of the actual performance times the evaluation importance, and then all added up. So if we're going to look at the overall score for apartment E, we'd multiply 2 by 35, plus 3 times 25, plus 5 times 20, plus 1 times 15, plus 5 times 5, sum all of that, and do that for each of the different options. And what we would end up getting, if you do all that math, you'll end up such that C will be the one that would yield the highest score. Then if we're going to use the conjunctive model where we have a minimum cutoff of 2, and remember this is a brand by brand model, so we'll start with brand A. We'll see that, look, this one has a 1, so this one is not acceptable. Brand B, everything is above a 2, so brand B is acceptable. Brand C is not acceptable because it has a score of a 1, so it's below the cutoff of 2. Brand D is acceptable. Everything is above 2. And then brand E is not acceptable because, again, it's got a score of 1, whereas our cutoff is 2. So if someone is using the conjunctive model, they'd either decide between B or D. Then, if we're using the lexicographic model, first what we do is we start with the attribute that is the most important. So here, cost is the most important to this particular person, and we look to see which option dominates on that most important attribute, and here we can see that A is the clear winner. If for whatever reason there had been a tie, so let's see, A wasn't in the running, and we'd have C or D, we'd then move to the next attribute for the tiebreaker, and we'd see that C would be the winner in this case. All right, so elimination by aspect model, where we go attribute by attribute and have an acceptable cutoff. Let's start with this cost criterion. We're going to end up eliminating option E, and then so all the rest of them are acceptable, and we move to the next round. In the next round, those are all acceptable, and so we'll move to the third round. We'll eliminate D here. And so then we'll move to this fourth round. And then here in this round, we would eliminate A and C. So B would be the winner here per the elimination by aspects decision rule. An the interesting thing about these decision rules is you can give people the exact same evidence, or they can have the exact same judgments about an option on different dimensions, but depending on the rule that they use or the model that they use to help make their decision, they'll actually end up with a different outcome.